I'm happy to welcome to the forum our resident historian, Vincent Dixon, to talk with us today. Vincent has spoken to us earlier on a number of occasions about, for example, the history of vaccination. He's also spoken with us about the plans for the American 250th anniversary coming up in a couple of years. And today he's going to talk about the legislative process in Massachusetts. This represents the interface between, I would say, the interface between technology, social issues, and policy making in Massachusetts. Vincent has a great deal of experience with this subject. And so, Vincent, welcome. I'll turn the floor over to you, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, friends. Good to see you. And this is a presentation that grows out of some of the activities I've done over the years. And in its own way, it's a hybrid presentation because it takes into account the evolution of our government and civic structure. One of the distinct challenges we have today is a lot of people have not had civics in high school, though Massachusetts passed a law about 4 years ago that is providing incentives, and gradually civics is coming back into the high schools. I often say that civics is the operating manual, the Constitution, the laws, the regulations, and history is how we got here. I try to be as objective as possible, good, bad, or ugly, as they say. So this will mate some of the aspects of civics and how the process works or doesn't, and how, looking forward, we might look at some reforms, because like many of us, I've recognized that the need for reforms is not purely a left or right or even centrist ideological thing, but actually looking at issues. And so I've developed something called the Expanded Massachusetts Agenda that actually, in some ways, is its own civics lesson, looking at what actual reforms in a straightforward, non-philosophical way, respecting the rule of law and the fact that we have a sort of hybrid of its own democratic Republican system. The legislative process and the rule of law, of course, underlie our system. And Massachusetts, though we are slow, is still often at the head of the pack. There is a kind of a unique reality that Massachusetts has always had, from the earliest point, a sense of constitutional order. The Mayflower Compact that was arrived at Plymouth, recognizing they didn't have a legal patent because they had been blown off course and they weren't entirely sure of where they were, but they needed a governing document. And the sense of natural law of John Locke and other thinkers had begun to suffuse, whether it was the English aristocracy or the grassroots religious dissenters. And so the Mayflower Compact was created and signed. The patent or authority for Massachusetts Bay, the charter, was brought here and led to quickly an evolution, which we'll touch on. And to this day, people have the capacity, often used, to petition, to ask for hearings, to talk about issues, whatever they are. So this should be
Vincent,
thought of
Vincent,
in the
Vincent,
broadest way possible.
Let me interrupt for just a moment. I don't know whether have attempted to advance slides, but we're still looking at number one. Are you?
That's right. I'm about 30 seconds to the first next slide.
Oh, okay. I just
This
wasn't
is
sure.
sort of
My
a
apologies.
pre-game warm-up
Yeah.
intro,
Okay. Okay.
except hopefully I have a better record than the Red Sox at home. Um, I note here in the subcategory exploring the balances between foundational stability and change, and our constitutional system is our foundation, but hopefully remains flexible enough that change can occur. And we're going to look at that in this presentation. Next. This is an actual picture of me. It's actually a picture from a Patriots Day observance, I believe, on Cambridge Common. My own background includes studying with who for many years was the Dean of Boston Historians, the late Dr. Thomas O'Connor. He earned his doctorate from Boston University. He was the historian of Boston College, which is also a university for some decades, a university historian, and he taught what many of us tend to follow, which is a narrative style for history. For over 20 years, I created a commercial tour that did more than just Harvard Yard. Cambridge, of course, is where the Continental Army was begun with George Washington, all kinds of other bits of history. Mass presentations is my doing business as, by which I do many presentations and have done many tours over the years. Next. My education includes being homeschooled by my parents, Harvard Extension School associate with honors of bachelor's, Harvard Graduate School of Education, a master's, and additional graduate work at Harvard Law School in Church and State, which is part of the history of Massachusetts, as the Sloan School of MIT and Radcliffe Institute. This is, as I noted, a hybrid presentation. We'll look at legislative process and history, the need for reform, and though there are opinion views, these are primarily non-ideological and pragmatic, solution-oriented proposals based on adaptation of real-world ideas. Next. You're welcome to take notes for your own benefit and for helping questions when we get to the end of the program for questions. The expanded Massachusetts agenda grew out of a sense of observing systemic grievances. Industries have been collapsing or profoundly changing. For example, printing, which used to be set by hand, now with computer formats, accounting, manufacturing, ultimately all fields, and the need for the structure to adapt and further hybridize as we go forward. Next. In looking at any legislative agenda in a systemic way, in terms of economy, one may think of career retraining. You have to think about the adjustment of job commitments, either ourselves or through various programs, the employment force planning of human resources, and the public government has to think about that just as surely as private individuals. The public education and recruitment of teachers and school systems and private and public colleges and universities. We have to make sure that economic activity is open, that there are mechanisms for employment matching, and ultimately the stronger economics, revenues, and employee satisfactions that we see today as we are entering yet a new era of technological and economic change. The original 6 proposals developed from a modest analytical thinking. Do people read and write? Do enough people read and write? What do we do in terms of matching with employment and how people graduate into a work economic situation? Media coverage, of course, has collapsed at the local level. So I used to write columns and still occasionally try to, but local papers are venues of information that are much weaker, and people are trying to substitute that on the electronic media. Establishing further detailed concepts by talking to people and employers and individuals is important, and I've managed to attract some interest. And to further continue and develop the general approach, this is something that larger scale legislative packages develop into or from across a wide variety of interest groups. The right of free petition is unique to Massachusetts. This is the only state in the United States where any individual can file legislation. Once every legislature, which is a 2-year session, you can file legislation through your state representative or state senator. They have to take that. Their staff may help you with some of that or not. And this is a foundational, fundamental, active tool of rights and process-oriented open society that goes back a long way. In other states, a state rep or state senator can be approached and may file your legislation or may not. They take seriously the notion that they're legislators, but not necessarily conduits in the way we might hear. The right of free petition is central to stability, to reform and societal dynamic, and actually welcoming people's opinions as actions proposed, not just opinions stated. Back in 1641, remember this is literally only 11 years after the European settlers of Massachusetts Bay came here, there is this body of liberties that is compiled by a Reverend Ward and is actually adopted by the General Court, the name of our legislature from an early point. And you'll notice some really interesting aspects here. Every man, whether an inhabitant or a foreigner, free or not free, shall have the liberty to come to any public court, council, or town meeting, and either by speech or writing to move any lawful, seasonable, and material question, or to present any necessary motion, complaint, petition, bill, or information, whereof that meeting has proper cognizance, so it is done in convenient time, due order, and respective manner. Just think about that. That means anyone, no matter what legal impediment they have, free or otherwise, indentured servant, and in many cases, even the women who owned property or had some other matter, anyone can come, require that at least the matter be heard. We still see that today in town meetings and city council, and that is a requirement of the law. Next. And further clarified in the Declaration of Rights of the Massachusetts Constitution from 1780 that the people have a right in an orderly and peaceable manner to assemble, to consult, to give instructions, and to request by the way of addresses, petitions, or remonstrances, redresses, or wrongs done to them of the grievances they suffer. Next. This is an early publication of the Massachusetts Constitution. You notice Constitution, a frame of government, and this was actually created largely in part by John Adams. There was an earlier attempt to pass a constitution for the state of Massachusetts. It was proposed and sent out by the Massachusetts legislature, and people said, no, there has to be a convention. That convention was then later convened after the proposal for state of Massachusetts Constitution was stopped, in part because John Adams wrote an article, a circulated publication that said the legislature should not be the one proposing a constitution. So a convention was created, and in fact, there was a committee of three, but John Adams, not unlike Thomas Jefferson with the U.S. Declaration of Independence, became the primary author. And this particular constitution, which we still have today, was unique in many ways because it had structure, organization, chapters, and sections. And so, though the content is slightly different, it provided a specific kind of model for the U.S. Constitution a few years later. The legislative term nowadays is 2 years. It used to be a 1-year term. Used to be that people were sent from their towns to the Massachusetts capital, basically in the winter, when there were no crops in the field and just a bit of livestock. People would go to Boston for a few months, debate some issues, much larger body at one point, including Maine. There were about 700 people. Those numbers have been cut several times and then changed to a 2-year term, and the governor and state officials now 4-year terms. But there are signposts over the course of a 2-year term that indicate that committees must release their recommendations, and effectively June 30th, the second legislative year, this year, is a general functional end of most legislative action. The legislative process, I understand that some people may understand this and some may not, has a very specific set of orders supervised by the clerk of the House or the clerk of the Senate and staff, and the filing of bills, with your legislator during the right of free petition. This is normally happening in January or late December, though the nominal date is in January. The legislature does have the opportunity to change that date. In the case of the pandemic, bills are allowed to be filed as late as sometime in February. Generally, it is sometime you're getting organized for it in late December, or you begin to provide the information in January. Docket numbers are originally assigned. Eventually, bill numbers are assigned, and additional processing assigns them to committees. And in Massachusetts, the committees are joint committees. So senators and House members sit together, the Joint Committee on Education, the Joint Committee on Judiciary, and it's a little bit unequal to some extent because there are always going to be more House members than Senate members, but it means that there's one hearing that both House and Senate committee members hear, as opposed to separate hearings, as you might find in most other states where there's a House committee for education and a Senate committee, and that tends to slow and alter the process. We're a little more efficient in that regard here, and there are hearings that are scheduled gradually over the course of about 18 months. Next. The hearing process itself is an area where there's been some concern because normally working people and others who have busy lives might want to know in advance, and sometimes there's as little as 3 or 4 days notice. The hearings can be attended in person. There's some now in recent years nice hearing rooms in the back part of the State House, which is near the House. You can attend in person or online in recent years with separate Zoom functions that will likely be kept. There is a committee process which is not open and generally not reported, and this is something reformers have been pushing on, what are called sunshine provisions. The weighting of importance of bills is important. Who wants them? What are they about? What is likely to happen? The public initiatives are feel-good ones like making the bee a state insect, substantive ones dealing with how business contracts, environmental hazards, licensing standards, and many other matters happen. So, for instance, some years ago, different changes in medicine and treatment modalities have meant changes in licensing of nurses and doctors. And there's a whole bunch of issues that come in with that. Nonprofit issue organizations include labor unions, environmental groups, consumer conservation law foundation goes back to really the early 1900s, well organized, well funded, and with decades of experience. Commercial lobbying interests as well. The Associated Industries of Massachusetts goes back a number of generations. In more recent years, the Mass High Tech Council, and in very recent years, centered in Kendall Square in Cambridge, the Mass Biotech Council, and they're often coming in with both desires to get a little bit of advantage in what they're doing, and sometimes actual needs to change statutory law to provide provisions that were not conceived of in a world that didn't have their particular technologies. The committee reports eventually happen. They're supposed to happen by a rule in February, but some bills can have extended deadlines or be sent to what are called study committees, except the study committees are what often is legislative death. Other provisions can happen much longer and more complicated. What happens with the leadership? The legislative calendar then is how bills are processed once the committees recommend and they're introduced to legislative chambers. The House is more likely to have financial and constituent service topics. It is the House that does move the state budget. The Senate is more oriented to policy matters and oversight thinking. In many ways, the Senate is more like a board of directors, and the House is more like a work group or a series of caucuses. The actual mechanism of passing a bill has the first reading for introduction. The second reading is usually where debate occurs if needed. The third reading is if a bill gets that far and there's support for it, and where perhaps amendments and technical changes are made or compromises. And voting is most often by a voice vote. If somebody objects, then you can go to a recorded roll call. One of the things that some reformers have talked about is less roll calls, so we don't know what people are voting for or against, since voice votes don't record what people say. The passage of bills, if the bills get that far, then leads to what's called passing to be engrossed, where technical amendments can be viewed, or somebody discovers that there's a comma or a semicolon, they would change the legal meaning, and those mistakes have to be corrected. And if it's an emergency bill, an emergency preamble is added along the way, which means the law would go into effect immediately. Normally, a bill has at least 90 days once it goes into passage before it takes effect, so people have some time to know that there is that law, word get about, and proper notice be provided. And there is the House and there is the Senate. If there are differences between the House or Senate, which happens sometimes, there's an opportunity to resolve them by conference committees. Ultimate enactment must be by both House and Senate. It goes to the governor, who may approve, disapprove, sign, veto, or allow a bill to become law. Legislative leadership: Speaker of the House, presently Ron Mariano; President of the Senate, Karen Spilka. Supreme Judicial Court does come into play here if there's a serious legal question and the legislature is not sure how the bill should be written or whether a particular solution would be legal. There is now a provision that people can ask, the legislature can formally request an opinion from the Supreme Judicial Court to guide the fashioning of their legislation. This is a newer provision, but a fairly wise one, because it avoids litigation and allows a law to be tailored in a way that would be legally in standard and not cause further litigation. Now we'll look at some of the proposals I have, which most of these come from actual issues that people have talked to me about or I've seen discussed. Judges and officials are appointed. They're confirmed by the Governor's Council, a body not everyone knows about. This would require reappointment and reconfirmation every 10 years, and it requires an updating of judicial officials to try to see that they may be keeping themselves up to date on court cases. But it does not institute elections of judges, which is a political campaign process that happens in many other states and can be a bit ugly. The grand jury is an important process, but with the district attorneys and that political process, many people think that that needs to be looked at, because well-organized district attorneys can railroad people into a jury trial or a lack of jury trial. And remember, the original grand jury system was simply the king would get together some friends and say, hey, we don't like you, and we're going to have charges against you. And that star chamber system is still a little bit there. Archibald Cox, many years ago, was brought in to look at the ordinary jury trials in Middlesex County, and he proposed the reforms we have today that have been much more effective in terms of having representative juries. And drugs are an important part of the whole system, because perhaps 80 to 90% of individuals in the criminal justice system are connected to drug addiction or drug trafficking or other problems. The literacy tax credit came about as a proposal because it turns out, though many people are nominally literate, they are not functionally fully literate. They may be able to sign their name or read the pictures in the Boston Herald, bit of a joke there, but they may not be able to read more sophisticated material, including the labels on medicines. And this is a classic conservative and liberal idea. I went to find out how literacy is dealt with in Massachusetts, and I found that community learning centers, which is where literacy is taught, not in the high school or general ed anymore, are overwhelmed with long waiting lists, not enough teachers, volunteers, and resources. And this is a mechanism by which, if you brought somebody to literacy, you'd get a tax credit, and it should be revenue neutral because the more people are able to read and understand, the better their jobs, the better their compensation, and reducing risk, which is part of life as well. Some people said, okay, so you get people literate. What happens with advancing in school? Many people drop out at third or fourth or fifth grade, and this takes that idea and expands it with a tax credit. These are mechanisms that would be regulated by the State Department of Education, and they would help people to improve their grade level. We look at political parties today. They have become very weak. The sell-by date is long past. 60% or more of Massachusetts registered voters, not everyone registers, do not have a designation that they choose for a political party. In recent years, a political designation was created. There are about 25 of them, and not too many people have signed up for those. Tax limitation, tax reform, tax changes, these are all issues, but they're now largely broken away from political parties. This would allow political parties to cross-endorse, and this is a system you have in New York, where there are fusion candidates. People have been elected as mayor of New York City with conservative or liberal support, in addition to Democrats or Republicans. And this would allow people to see what the coalitions politically are. So is it Democrats and liberals or Democrats and conservatives? In Massachusetts, those parties would have to run independent candidates against each other, and you lose something of the capacity for coalitions that are constructive in accomplishing anything in a governing political system. The right of free petition is something that, frankly, is not known by a lot of people. And I think whether you're in a technical field or legal field, or you simply have property and tax issues, if more people knew about this, they might file more legislation or consult with people on these things. And this basically is simply a mechanism that would urge the legislature to publicize this, just as there is a publication by the Secretary of State about candidates just run. There would be hopefully some publication that would say something to the effect of legislation improving government, just write it. Next. Newer proposals that we'll look at expand across a wider range of issues. I've attracted some other ideas and suggestions, and since every 2 years we can file legislation, I write it up. Emily Ann works with me to make it look okay and check the grammar, and then we file it. And this is open to further expansion. If you have ideas, or if you have ideas that you want to write legislation, we can work together. The window, as I'll note at the end, will be coming up in December or January of 2025, every 2-year cycle. Now, political parties are clubs that are weakening, as I noted. People go in and they see presidential preference names. Who are these other names on the ballot? They see a dozen or more names. These are political party offices, and most people don't know anything about them. And money is spent. People running for state committee, which are effectively the legislatures of the major parties. There's often conflicts of interest because some members of state committee, Democratic and Republican, are state employees, and the flows of money and their interests need to be disclosed. Presently, all campaign contributions have to be disclosed if you're running for office, but not for political office. And this is a gap in our system through which a lot of money, including dirty money, is flowing, and this ought to be required to be publicly documented. Political party officials, little known to most people, have influence because they're involved in selecting the election officials. Most of them in Massachusetts we know to be knowledgeable, quite dedicated, but their presence and actual roles are often relatively opaque. There are Democrats, there are Republicans, and independents or unenrolled is really their correct term, are often not there. And so it makes some sense legally that all political party officials, since they are involved in the selection or recommendation of election officials should also be required to take an oath of office, which is legally recorded. We move into some economic and other structural issues. Bridge employment training is a proposal that addresses important and vital economic disruptions with a practical umbrella, coordinating educational opportunities for all with schools, training, and positions. There's been some work done in the late stages of the Baker administration and the early stages of the Healy administration. So we'll have to work on this a little bit more, but basically it would require a 2-year training program opportunity, including internships with connection also to a job at the end of the program. And this is designed to reduce the mismatch of employable individuals and improve the skill needs for various job openings. State antitrust is important. Many people are aware of the challenges of CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid, and their challenges in actually providing appropriate prescriptions. And same is true with other retail stores. Think about downtown Boston, which used to have 6 or 7 department stores. Maybe that could be winnowed out, but we got down to 2 with Filene's and Jordan Marsh, and the prior state attorney general intervened. And for several years, Filene's and Jordan's were actually independent competitors, and that kept hundreds of jobs going and more choices for consumers and prices. Competitors often don't like each other, but they actually are helping each other to have stronger businesses. And this is something that needs to be looked at and engaged more heavily. The Attorney General of Massachusetts is actually the most powerful official because they can accept or veto town meeting warrants and other local municipal actions far beyond the powers of the governor to intervene in legal matters. Middlesex County is 54 cities and towns, one of the larger counties, largest in Massachusetts in terms of wealth. It is one of the 20 wealthiest counties in the United States. We have all kinds of issues with environment, with wealth, with apartments, with housing, various forms of development, and many of these cities and towns have fairly thin staffs. In Cape Cod, the county government, as in many places in Massachusetts, collapsed. They put together a different solution. The Cape Cod Regional Commission is a cooperative federation of municipalities, and it does provide opportunity for information in many different ways. Transportation is a real problem, and one of the biggest problems of it, when you actually look at the detail, is there are grants available for extension or improved transit, but the money to match grants is often not there. Money, if it exists at all, is for operating expenses. This would provide a mechanism that would commit money in an endowment format and encourage revenue businesses at or near the T stations so that there would be matching funds for federal things. And also those federal grants, when they come in, could be targeted as well a little bit more. There's no reason that a 60-seat diesel bus couldn't be supplanted or replaced in off hours by smaller electric van fleets to provide more flexible service, a little bit more friendly to people. Think of all the vans at Logan Airport. Think about those scattered about our urban environment. That would be an improvement of some sort. Anna Lavalette was a Winchester resident who died as a result of a pedestrian traffic accident. Wonderful lady, sad death. As we're driving about at night with many people, we notice that people are wearing dark clothes. You can't see them at night. Even more importantly, the crosswalks often wear out. And this is an idea to look at a scientific standard for lumen measurement that would require, with some partial state incentives, that those be kept to a higher standard, literally, so that the crosswalks do not wear out. Next. Minimum hourly health wage looks at health issues. The great growth by Many people of having to work several part-time jobs means that above and beyond mass health and private services, how do you get access to that kind of material? A good employer may give wonderful healthcare benefits, and a bad employer will keep you under 20 hours and you don't get much. This would mean that for every hour an employee worked, whatever the employer, there would be a minimum health benefit that would be portable, that could be packaged. So if you work 60 hours, you'd have 60 hours of at least a minimum benefit. Would tend to reward the good employers and require the less responsible employers to think about occasionally perhaps turning a couple of part-time jobs into a full-time job with a little bit better access to health care. Mental health, unfortunately, has been an area that has grown as a problem even before the pandemic. And privacy is not always respected. And this is what should just be ethical standards that would be required, essentially, a little updating of what should be ethical behavior in healthcare institutions. Common Core, of course, is controversial to some people. In general, there's a large scale consensus by liberals, conservatives, and centrists that Common Core is a flawed curriculum. Tens of thousands of people, including teachers, signed to put this on the ballot some years ago. The Supreme Judicial Court, on pure technicalities, ruled it off. There are proposals in the current cycle that might address this. This simply takes the original language that the people did sign to put on the ballot and provides it as legislation. Certainly, these are issues that are complex, but people should have the right to vote. And this was an example where the people's right to vote was denied. And there was another example in Middlesex County when a Middlesex County charter was developed, written, and proposed, and the state legislature would not put it on the ballot. So the legislature, on some occasions, has denied people the right to vote on issues that they should have, kind of marring our long, wonderful history of people having the right of free petition. When you come to legal hearing officers, many people are tremendous lawyers and judges, but not all have quite the background we might hope. And the real issue is that as technology and sociology change, a lot of judges don't necessarily keep themselves up to date. And there are a lot of different legal hearing officers, whether it's in unemployment or labor relations or recognition or discrimination. And this would require systematic training, a pilot program that would also work with law school graduates to get them in the direction of being judges, because we're usually short judges and short, well-trained judges. Too often judges come about because they gave a contribution to somebody who became governor, and there is a flavor of conflict of interest. Clerk magistrate is, again, unique to Massachusetts. It's a quasi-judicial role. If there are charges in an early legal filing, they hear it before a judge in many cases. This would require that all clerk magistrates have or earn a law degree from an accredited law school, and the Attorney General authorized to ensure their continued training. Often these officials appear to have excessive political connections. It's a great job to have, maybe $90,000 or $95,000 a year salary, little known to the general public, and needs to be further professionalized if we keep the system at all. If we look at our system, we have improved it in many ways, particularly in Massachusetts. Originally, a young man as a secretary to a lawyer would learn the law, read the law. Then we created law schools, and this is taking a step further to creating a judge school, ultimately. It turns out that there is a very minimal training program. Most judges have been either defense attorneys or prosecutors. And for the first year, certainly there are questions as to whether somebody who is a defense attorney ever sees a guilty person in front of them, potentially, or a prosecutor sees an innocent person in front of them, potentially. And this actually would create a new pathway and a requirement to create a graduate judicial training school. In some other countries, in fact, there are training programs for judges who are appointed separately from being attorneys. And some of us think that would be an advance in the quality of our justice, given some of the questions and issues we have today. Police are part of the law enforcement system. We know there have been concerns about the quality of policing, and it has led to a process for police officer certification. There was just a case that came up where a police officer has been determined to not be meeting the standards and will never be allowed again to be a police officer in Massachusetts. This goes one step further. Teachers and superintendent of schools work together, but a superintendent of schools has a different certification process. They are a manager responsible to the public in a different way. Nurses and doctors work together, but they have different licensing standards. This would establish a police chief certification process because the management of a police force is certainly distinct from the police officers themselves. And I think this would be an important reform. And at least one legislator in the state Senate told me that was something they hadn't thought of when they talked about police officer certification. We have lost lots of nurses and lots of physicians to burnout, to retirement, injury from the pandemic and other circumstances. We are very short locally and nationally in terms of nurses and physicians, and these are scholarships that would require commitment to Massachusetts healthcare institutions for a time in exchange for some scholarship aid so that we might increase the number of nurses and physicians and their quality as well, particularly since we serve not just Massachusetts, but our great health institutions such as Mass General and others serve the world. We need more than many other states, and we should set about improving that workforce as we are really at risk in terms of how thin it is. The boards and commissions, Massachusetts has about 730. These are the ones that govern the licensing of physicians and nurses and doctors and lawyers and engineers and plumbers and electricians. And these are very important bodies, little known, and they often fail to meet their legal quorums because of membership vacancies. This would be a mechanism that has been utilized in some places to recruit a if you will, deep bench of people who might be qualified or interested in public service. Both the Baker and Healy administrations have been trying to close the gap, but there's still a big gap, and this common registry of competent and interested people would help that issue, because if there's not a quorum on a board or commission, they cannot take legal actions. The electoral system in Massachusetts is also an odd one. We're one of 6 states to have a so-called primary after Labor Day. Those states all have a single-party system. In Nevada, the primary is in October. You have a month for a general election. Most states tend to have a primary in late spring or early summer, and this would restore a reasonable pause for 3 or 4 months for a general election, and also for a bit of a pause during the summer for everybody, instead of forcing a primary in people's face as they're bringing their children back to school, starting their work life, dealing with various religious holidays. It's generally pretty rude and a bit chaotic in early September. This would separate the election back to sometime in late spring when everyone's still here. And though they're busy, maybe have a few hours to be aware of primaries that in fact determine the elections. Many times a Democratic primary, or in a few cases a Republican primary, determines who will be on the final ballot and who will be elected in that district. And this would make that process a little bit more friendly and a little more open. We have unfortunate problems in recent years based on changes in demographics, changes in cultures, and many other things. we see schools closing, we see churches closing, we see other institutions closing, in many cases, not because there isn't a requirement or a constituency for those, but because the management of them, be it churches or schools or others, simply are incompetent and lost the financial stability. This would provide a mechanism that people in those institutions who wanted to keep them going as a school, as a church, or as another institution could do so. Presently, the law basically means that if you close and go out of business, that building remains perhaps empty for several years. This would establish a process that members of those organizations could step up and say, we would like to keep doing those services because there's enough of us, and we would do our own financial process, and it would provide a mechanism for making sure that this was legitimate, because oftentimes schools or churches or other institutions are in the center of town and are a landmark that becomes an eyesore unless put back into service, and this would make sure that that was able to be done on a much quicker basis. Foreign policy is important in Massachusetts because of the demographics of people from so many countries. The Aquinos from the Philippines, President Tu from Vietnam, and many others, a large number of people in the Merrimack Valley from Cambodia. They've come here. They are fortunate to be here. They're mostly pleased and engaged citizens, ultimately, when they become citizens. In the meantime, active taxpayers and children in the schools. And so foreign policy, though we need to be careful of the U.S. government and respectful, we should have the ability to advocate. We've always done that. And the next two proposals deal with that. Syria has been a great genocide before the most recent events. And this references the broader UN legal courts and advocates that charges be more fully brought. There's some action, but it needs to be encouraged. And NATO, which of course the United States is a member of a military nation. There is a council, or really a small parliament, called the Atlantic Council. People need to simply know more of it. If you don't like NATO, still you should know a little bit more about the legal mechanisms by which NATO operates. It is an organic military body, much more like a country than many people realize. And this is simply a public education effort for one of our more important activities as a nation that has saved millions of lives in Europe and secured the peace in many ways, the longest period of peace in Western Europe, certainly in centuries. Healthcare is an important issue, of course. We've touched on that. It continues to be one of the top important issues for all of us. And a number of states, many European countries, and most newer countries have it in their foundational documents. The United States does not, and Massachusetts does not, and efforts to have medical and health care reform are statutory but not fundamental. This would do that. And I thought, well, what do people think about it? Let's see further. And so I worked with the Attorney General's office to create a public policy non-binding ballot question to our state representative. It was placed on the ballot in 2018. 64.4% said yes, 35.6% said no, and all 8 precincts in Winchester and in the 7 precincts in Stoneham voted yes for it. So it was an interesting public policy exercise and an opportunity to talk about influence on legislators. It hasn't moved the ball very much, but it's an interesting educational effort. Chapter 40B is, of course, important to the requirements for affordable housing. A lot of issues. This would make some reforms and improvements that would give just a little more voice to municipalities on conservation lands, wetlands, environmental impact, and health and safety issues, and improved local area transportation options so that communities feel a little more part of the process. Community housing packages are important because we need to provide for municipalities the opportunities to build housing, not just by requirement, but by encouragement. A little example, many years ago, NFL football teams would say you have to lose 30 pounds before you come into camp. And oftentimes players came in 30 pounds overweight, they'd be fined. Somebody had a good idea. Let's provide an incentive. And so if you come in and have taken off the 30 pounds that you were told to take off, you get an incentive of $5,000 or $10,000 for the year. Suddenly, a bunch of guys who didn't care were losing that weight and coming in better shape. And that's an example of much of what happens in America, which is incentives to create good things, not just requirements. And this, if you think about it, should not just be the densification of eastern Massachusetts. If you take the 351 cities and towns and take away the 101 that are in the metropolitan area of eastern Mass, there's still 250 communities out there. If you take the more recent MBTA Communities Multifamily Act, take 351 minus 177 that are subject to that, there's still 174 communities. And these are communities beyond 495 in central and western Mass that have, in many cases, unused rail lines that have fallen into disuse that could be restored. Regional transportation, the legislature has some appetite to help regional transportation. And this would be an opportunity to encourage housing development at much lower cost than it would be in Boston, Cambridge, or even here in Winchester. We need to do our job in providing some of that housing, but the state as a whole is short 100,000 units over the last 20 years. Going forward, 100 to 130,000 units, and we're not going to make up that gap by just a few units here or there. It has to be done by a large scale. Massachusetts grew in the prior 10 years by about 450,000 people, so a small number of people who've left. Still, there is that 500,000 or so people that are here that need housing, that have changed the demand basis over what it was many years ago. Housing should be a constitutional right, many people think, but how do you manage that? And there are three standards that I've looked at in talking to people. Ongoing planning, so we know what housing might be needed over time, and policies are pursued that encourage its creation of high quality units, not just cheap plywood and something that's thrown up at a high price, but something, if it's well constructed and reasonably varied, will last for a long time. If a housing lasts 20 or 30 years and then is demolished because it was cheap construction, we've lost the investment in the first place. We should spend just a little more, encourage stronger incentives for higher quality housing that might last 60 or 70 years with some rehabilitation over time. And that brings us to the need for next forward. The restoration, rehabilitation, and new construction are all different ways in providing housing, and this recognizes that should be without discrimination across a wide range of the population. And finally, across the geography of the Commonwealth. We are a Commonwealth, not just a state, and we should reduce the excess densification of Greater Boston and spread it out a little. There's a lot of empty land out there, and or facilities from downtowns that were at their heyday in the 1920s that could be rescued and restored with some charm. Employable skills training goes back to what I referenced earlier, a 2-year requirement of employable skills training with some bridge linkages. This would be a constitutional right. Lottery tickets are one of those things that people buy without sales tax. Seems a little bit curious. The lottery ticket, whether we like it or not, is a product or service. And in fact, the lottery is being run on a subsidized basis without directly contributing sales tax to the transaction, though the revenue does eventually go to the Commonwealth. I don't see much difference. Most of us don't see much difference between a tax on tobacco products or possibly other items and lottery tickets, and this would provide a little more revenue and perhaps a little bit of a disincentive for the gamblers who find it a challenge to daily life. Vaccination, controversial to some, but we know it works for most people. those people who might want to do it or haven't the time or find it a bit of cost. There have been some subsidies for COVID vaccination. This would simply provide a statutory incentive for those who wish to be vaccinated. And if this works well, it could be extended to other vaccinations as they come out with newer diseases. COVID has taken thousands of lives, more than many wars. Memorials are opportunities to inform, to educate, and to respect. This bill has been given an extended deadline, I understand. There is some interest in perhaps what would be a unique memorial, but there are other unique memorials in Boston, and surrounding one of them in Boston remembers the rights of animals and how we now treat animals a lot better. This would be something talking about people and how we respect the people who've died and the struggles that they've gone through. Registry of motor vehicles, many people drive 50 or 60 miles to work. They are nearby a local town hall that's not in their community, and those cities and towns that might want to provide registry services would be empowered to do so. I know AAA does that. This town hall in your local community of work is as important perhaps as town hall or city hall where you live and might not be able to get back to in time. We register people to vote, and yes, it provides voting registration for your local community, but also for state and federal elections. There's a state database that has helped to reduce fraud. This would do something with the registry as well. We know the registry is too often has long lines, short lines in 350 local communities might be helpful as an additional aspect and a friendly face. Too often registry faces are not as friendly as we'd like them to be. Public education on the ERA, a much longer discussion, but the national ERA was ratified in 38 state Virginia several years ago. The House of Representatives, the U.S., has recognized the 38th ratification. The Senate has voted 52 votes. They need to get to 60 by the artificial filibuster standard. But this would provide a degree of advocacy. Massachusetts has had our ERA since 1976, but the federal courts in Massachusetts are not required to follow the Massachusetts ERA standard, and we need to educate people, and this is an advocacy project that I think would be helpful. Climate change is a big issue. This is one that would look at risk reduction in the mentality of insurance adjusters. How do we reduce risk? How do we adjust for it when we have higher winds and roofs start to fly off sooner than they should? How do we provide the tax credits for work, other issues meant to be an information gathering and reporting mechanism? Environmental and water testing funding often are short revenue. This provides an innovation that would mean that as long as it's above board and carefully done, tax donation credits would allow this testing to be done so that potential construction sites could be cleaned up more quickly and more effectively. The German Green Dot program looks at package reduction. We all get packages. This is not a perfect program in Germany. There's some issues with it, but this would look at incentives to manufacturers and shippers to reduce source packaging safely. The entire recycling industry is challenged. In Massachusetts, we're running out of any room for waste and or recycling. We're largely shipping that out of state, and we desperately need more solutions, and this would be an incentive in that direction. Environmental quality enforcement. This would provide a private citizen right of action, much as is possible at the federal level. Artificial grass is a major issue. We just heard this week the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level has talked about PFAS dangers, which are forever chemicals that damage fertility and other human conditions. And plastic grass has got a real problem. This would put a moratorium for at least 3 years to look at the dangers and look at the alternatives. A commission to look at athletic services to restore permeability to playing surfaces with newer forms of actual grass and hybrid forms. There's opportunity here and something that has to be done because people are suffering from exposure to these chemicals that are in plastic turf. Governor Volpe was a resident of Winchester for decades during his public career. This is a bill that would add his name. It would be the John A. Volpe Winchester Center Station, an opportunity for respect and for education. Winchester Town Meeting has a warrant article now seeking support for this, which has received a favorable recommendation from the Joint Committee on Transportation. We're nearing the end here. And finally, though immigration is a controversial issue, this is simply a mechanism that has begun to be developed by federal state administrative cooperations that would seek to identify migrants, give them interim papers so that at least people know who they are, and pending federal legislation or administrative solutions until the 1890 Asian Immigration Act, which was anti-Asian and California prejudice. Immigration was not a federal issue. This doesn't take away federal powers, but it would add state services to it so that we can process things in a more effective way. Since we know it's an issue, the question is not whether we deal with these issues, but how we deal with them. And there's a variety of different responses, as with any complex problem. The expanded Massachusetts agenda includes these bills. I hope you see that from this, the mechanism of right of free petition, hearings before committees on elections or education or economic development provide information to legislators. Advocacy from people on the ground affects what happens in the buildings. I welcome questions. I welcome support. And more importantly, if any of you who have ideas in terms of technical issues, laws, research, public policy, have ideas, you or others, you have a window from late December into late January by which bills can be filed, your own ideas that can help to educate the public sphere. And I'd be happy to work with you. And next. The legislative text resources online include going to masslegislature.gov. You can see the text of these and many other bills, the hearings, the events, the legislative session for this year still going forward. And this is my encouragement to be in touch with me. This is me in front of Town Hall on a pleasant cold day and with a sterling ware made Navy-style pea coat from East Boston. We do make them here. And my email, vincedixon99@yahoo.com. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a better feeling now for something of the legislative process from some ideas of reform, and feel inspired to perhaps come up with some of your own or to educate your fellow citizen and resident. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. At moments like this, I'm often reminded of the comment made by MIT President Jerry Wiesner. I think somehow there we go. I'm always reminded of the comment by former MIT President Jerry Wiesner, who likened an MIT education to a drink from a fire hose. And I think you've given us the equivalent in terms of this very important interface between social policy, social issues, policymaking, technology, and you've provided us a great depth and breadth of the efforts here in Massachusetts to make our lives more comfortable and to provide leadership in terms of policymaking. So I thank you for that. I do have a question, and I think there will be some others, but I want to start with this concept of an individual's right to free or to file legislation.
It's called the Right of Free Petition,
Yeah.
and it is literally a petition on any legal matter that must be heard by any legal body in the Commonwealth, local or state.
Let me ask you a question about that, though. I know that you were very instrumental in the legislation that has been filed relating to the naming of the town, the rebuilt town train station in the name of John Volpe, which I support. I think that's a good idea. But I'm just wondering, was that filed using this mandate, the individual right of a free petition? How did you do that? Tell us.
Yes, that is the case. I noticed along the way, as a historian, that Governor McCall, had a school named after him, and there isn't even a single plaque to John Volpe. And John Volpe's life actually is rather similar and parallel at a later point. Governor McCall supervised and organized a state constitutional convention over 3 years that brought the governor's term from 1 year to 2 year, reorganized the state government, and did a number of other very good things. Governor Volpe reorganized state government and created the cabinet system that was long overdue. The governor's term changed from 2 years to 4 years, and very much a honest reform type person like Samuel McCall, and I think worthy of at least some modern or postmodern respect. He was earlier point a state official that made the decision to lift the rail crossing from street level to the elevation it has today, likely saving many lives and much injury. And Peter Engeldrum, another historian in our town, wrote or did a short movie called The Wall, a different definition of it, that looks at the original struggle to get that elevation and the ultimate success of it, because John Volpe made the decision. He just thought it seemed rational and safe. And rather amusingly and pleasantly, Peter asked me to read out a few of the words of John Volpe, and so I went back, and there are some clips of John Volpe's speeches, and so I practiced a voiceover as John Volpe, but I'm still Vince Dixon.
Yeah. Let me ask you about the mechanics of doing this, though. Did you write the original legislation and then pass it on to our town representative or
I'm fortunate that I have a good writing background, and yes, I sat down, looked at the topic, wrote out some language. I then checked it through our state senator, Jason Lewis. His chief of staff and legislative counsel, once again, is Dennis Burke.
Yep.
And they basically looked at it and said, it's fine. I got good grades at Harvard in writing and practical writing. And so it was filed, and then went through the hearing process. Fortunate in this case, because many people remember John Volpe, that Rep. Donato, a Democrat from Medford, said, oh, sure, this is great. And Rep. Brad Jones, a Republican leader from North Reading, said, oh, John Volpe was a great man, of course. So we have a Democrat and a Republican. They got a favorable recommendation from the Transportation Committee. It's now at one of the more powerful committees, Senate Ways and Means, on which Senator Lewis sits. Rep. Day thought it was a great idea, but thought I should do more. And so hence the town warrant that will be at town meeting that urges support for it. The property of the station is T, therefore state. And they're the ones with the ultimate authority. So a state bill, if passed and signed by the governor, would rename the station. Or it's really not renaming it, it's adding John Volpe's name to it.
Right, sure.
So every step along the way in advocacy and legal form and respectful petition tends to accomplish things. I've done this before in other contexts.
Well, I just want to compliment you because you've this great demonstration of a citizen taking action to do something they felt was significant, and I agree with that. So I think what you've done is important for the town of Winchester, and I applaud it.
Well, thank you. And everyone on the call, certainly with an idea, can think about it, and we can help get them to staff at Rep. Day's office, including Talia Quinn, Dennis Burke at Senator Lewis's office, and I can help guide the process if somebody has a good idea. At least at the beginning, it's an education process, and then maybe eventually some action.
Sure. We have some hands up, Vincent. Let's go to Tom.
Vincent, hi. I was wondering if you happen to have any statistics or any knowledge of how many of these petitions actually have gotten passed through the whole legislative process. And, have there been any, significant well-known ones that have made it through the process?
Small numbers. I think the best record is elementary school classes that, as a civics exercise, have sometimes filed something for, I think, the bee is a state insect, and there have been some other kinds of things, but it shows that something can be done. Generally, ideas like this eventually lead to somebody saying, that's an interesting idea, but maybe we have to do it a different way. And then eventually you attract the interest of some state official who has a need. You also have, both at the federal and the state level, kind of waves of legislation. Right now, we're in a flat period where people are afraid of lots of things and not much is happening. That's an issue in terms of sunshine. But if you look at the great progressive wave of Teddy Roosevelt, much legislation was passed. And then nothing happened until the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the New Deal, where in 100 days, actually several hundred bills were passed. These were ideas that had been gestating and developed over the intervening 20 years or so. And then when people say, okay, it is time to make some reform, it's kind of like, okay, my haircut's gone more than a month. I need to get it. And I don't get to it for maybe 6 weeks, but I definitely have to get it because I'm going to a wedding or a funeral or something like that. There are waves of progress and waves of not progress. But this is part of the educational process that the Right of Free Petition provides. And when people go to town meeting, or they go to the select board, or they go to a city council, these are opportunities to inform and educate, which are less common outside of New England because we do have town meetings and more grassroots requirements to constitutional petition.
Yeah, if I could just ask one quick follow-up then. So how would you rate the efficacy of this approach rather than the ballot referendum approach that we also use in the state?
Well, an issue that's both good and bad, and that's money. The ballot question, that's a advisory public policy one that I crafted and obtained passage of for the state rep district, required a fair amount of work. If you're doing a statewide question, you're talking about a cheap ballot question with a lot of volunteers and some enthusiasm still might cost upwards of $1 million. The Equal Rights Amendment was passed in Massachusetts for our Commonwealth, but it took an effort of probably 2.5 to 3 years. At that time in 1975, $76 was something like 2 or 3 million. So grassroots activity is lower cost, a little bit longer in the tooth, but does educate people. Eventually, a state rep or a state senator, more often a state senator, will look at the policy implications of a constituent idea and then say, okay, I'll go with it. Cindy Friedman next door in Lexington was approached about Quack Walker Day, which would celebrate the emancipation of Quack Walker by the Constitution of Massachusetts in the 1700s, and thought it was an interesting and good idea, and she advocated for it, and it got passed. And it's an opportunity to educate people that we ended slavery long before the Civil War in Massachusetts by people taking independent legal action.
All right, we have 3 more hands and about 5 more minutes. So let's go to Albert.
Yeah, hi. Question about training that you're suggesting for the judicial. I made a similar recommendation in an engineering society that engineers have to demonstrate that they are retaining the knowledge, they're up to date, etc. And I'll tell you, I made a lot of enemies on that. Even though in the doctor profession, doctors have to go so much training to get their license. So I just wonder, you or anybody else, if you have any thoughts on that, whether it really makes sense to push for continuous training during someone's career.
continuing education credits are increasingly present in many fields. In the early stages, they were a bit minimal. They've gradually grown in strength. Some of you may know Emily Ann, my partner, is a figure skating judge, and she has to take a test every year to remain an active figure skating judge, and actually several different tests ranging from safe sport, which is proper ethical conduct, to actually technical moves and rules. And it occurred to me along the way, as I'm looking at the fact that judges are not equally trained, ultimately, we as a society move incrementally and slowly, but we do move incrementally. And as long as we're focusing on standards, I applaud you for bringing forth the need for engineers to remain current, because our professionals need to be not just professionals, but current. Emily Ann just passed me a note. She had 6 different tests to take this year to remain a current figure skating judge. If we can have those kind of requirements for a technical entertainment that people enjoy and mostly don't know that there are legal requirements for, surely we should have that for most other professional fields. The continuing education credits move in that direction, but we need to encourage that, perhaps provide a few educational tax credits that might help the advancement of that.
Thank you.
Eddie.
Yes, actually, I'm going to be rather facetious in the following respect. People expect enormous amount of education and training and maintenance of their professional perspectives. What about the politicians? I've always been curious that anyone could become a politician, but not really need to know that much as long as they can get elected. So here's my question: what about the training of politicians and their ethics and their morality and so forth to maintain high standards for getting through bills and so forth?
Well, you opened a door for me there, because I'm standing up facing the presentation, and you're sitting down, so we could slightly divert to the comedy sphere. I'm not proposing licensing of comedians, though there are some bad comedians that might not meet licensing requirements, since you suggested a facetious question. More seriously, when legislators are elected, there is a school for about 6 weeks with 2 sessions per week. They receive about 15 hours of training so that they at least know the parliamentary motions of first reading, second reading, hearings, and legal processes, and what is confidential and what is public. You are correct in some ways, but we have generally thought that a part of the sunshine of requiring donations to be reported, which I'm talking about expanding, about requiring, well, the League of Women Voters does a great public service by asking questions to which one, as a candidate, has to respond, where you can see whether a candidate has depth or shallowness. So it's not a perfect process, and antitrust could restore some of the competitive media that we need to do in having more factual coverage. But thank you for the question, and you're on the right track. But maybe if you think comedians should be licensed, we should have a discussion about that.
Well, I wasn't really suggesting that, but I will say this, that the current level of education, for example, in science and technology for many politicians seems to be lacking. That we've had a number of cases and instances which concern me. I won't go into them because there's just not enough time, but things like quantum computing, and I was just reading about the European Parliament basically needing to consider issues around data encryption and so forth.
Or as we say in Massachusetts, data. Europe
Data
is
encryption.
often ahead of us. The European Parliament has done some good work there. And sometimes legislators from the United States have gone over and talked to their peers in the European Union because they're slightly ahead on terms of regulation, slightly behind us in terms of nationalistic, jingoistic stuff. But your point is well taken. I think we might have a couple more questions, Avi and
Yeah, I'm
Marty.
gonna,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Martin, you're up.
First of all, I think that was a very interesting presentation on state government. I learned quite a bit, and I want to thank you for that. A minor point. I think the cabinet form of government was introduced under Frank Sargent. I don't think it was Volpe. And the reason I say that is in 1968-69, I was asked by a colleague from law school to take a leave of absence from my firm 1 year to work with the committee to establish a cabinet form of government in Massachusetts. The incentive for that was that there were over 300 agencies, committees, groups, etc., with legislative and other significant responsibility in Massachusetts that reported directly to the governor and no one else, which means for most of them, they were unregulated. They were their own fiefdom.
Yeah.
And so there was a committee to establish state government. It was chaired by Leverett Saltonstall, and this was under Frank Sargent. I did take the leave of absence from the firm. I went up to the State House. I shared an office in the East Wing and drafted the legislation. And it was
Well, I thank you for the additional information. I will have to follow up with you because it sounds like there's some important oral history. Frank Sargent was, of course, John Volpe's lieutenant governor. And a transportation and road guy himself who recognized the limitations of that. So I will follow that up with you. You're exactly right. 300 department heads and agencies reporting to the governor one-to-one didn't work. Many of them never got an appointment and continued to muddle along, good or bad, for years without streamlining. And even this administration has done some additional changes in streamlining. And one of the things that is, I think, not fully understood in terms of this is that Massachusetts, with a budget of about 56 billion and an economy that's far larger, is one of the 15 wealthiest countries in the world if it was just Massachusetts. So we have tremendous resources we don't always allocate or intersect well. I thank you for your appreciation of this. And, this is, as I say, civics is the operating manual, and history is how we got here. And I appreciate the additional information, and I will follow that up with you. And thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Another interesting sidelight of that, by the way, and then I'll finish, was that I sat in the upper chambers, in the Senate gallery when the bill was up for passage. Morris Donahue was the Senate president at the time. He was violently opposed to the bill because it would actually diminish his and others' powers to make appointments, etc. So their control of the government would be diminished. So he was opposed to it until Howie Carr of the Boston Herald wrote a series of articles just before the election. And the article said, anyone that opposes this bill does not want to see good, clean government in Massachusetts. That article came out just a few days before the election, and Marcy Donahue was up for re-election. So I watched as Morris Donovan relinquished the gavel as speaker, walked down to the floor and said, I am proud to support this wonderful bill. Hypocrisy at its finest, I witnessed firsthand. That's it.
Well, that's a wonderful story.
That's a great story.
Of course, it shows the comedic potential for licensure for Howie Carr in addition to his journalistic credentials. Avi has a hand up, I think.
Yeah, Avi will have the last word. Go ahead, Avi.
One of the things that troubles me as I hear all these some interesting ideas is I wonder why the state is involved. You mentioned about I guess your partner has some involvement as a judge with regard to figure skating. Now, I don't understand why that has to be state regulation, state licensure of that, or of barbers, or of plumbers, or of a whole bunch of other occupations. It seems to me that the private sector can take care of this. You can have things from the good housekeeping seal of approval. Organizations would come up that would have their own standards, and people can make decisions if they want to employ somebody who has certain credentials or not. There's this ever expanding bureaucracy where the government gets into every corner of our lives. And I think we're suffering because of that. It is government grown too large, too powerful, and too intrusive. So I wonder if some of these things could just be left to the private sector. And I'm sure that the ice skating industry could figure out a way to regulate itself and to have judges that it considers to be appropriate. I mentioned ice skating only because it came up. I wouldn't have thought of it. But there are a whole bunch of other occupations which I think could be regulated by themselves without introducing all the vagaries and possible corruptions of a state legislature that never seems to end its session and has a number of bureaucratic problems that we all are familiar with and that we live under because of this.
You make some good points, Avi. I tend to be a bit centrist. Sometimes you and I have shared some libertarian thoughts that you have there. We do live in a Commonwealth that tends to be heavily regulated. There are those who think that the 725, 730 boards and commissions could be reduced to a number similar to other large states, which is closer to 500. There are boards and commissions that have not met for periods of time that maybe should be sunsetted. But what I'm reflecting here is more a question of quality. Once you've reached a level of quality or you're incentivized to do it, then you're better able to operate in the marketplace. So there's a bit of a hybrid aspect to that. And in the skating world, in fact, some of that, including safe sport, has come about because of scandals that were in a purely private context. The church scandals here in Massachusetts, ultimately, there had to be some law enforcement and some requirements by state law for people to report abuse because abuse was not being reported on a private basis. So there is this intersection between state rights, the empowerment of individuals to have the quality and standards to make judgments. In terms of overregulation, that's a much broader discussion, but I think antitrust is one of the few powers that really is important because it encourages competition. And we see what has happened in downtown Boston with the failure of competition and the monopolistic mentality. We have more people living in downtown Boston than have lived there in 200 years, and yet the streetscape is more empty with less commerce. So one has to look at these things not just philosophically, but also sometimes episodically in a back and forth, not to make too fine a point of the comedian bit, but any performer of quality with an audience, people go to hear the great violinists, the great conductors, and most of those people have taken more training, earned more degrees, or done more study in their fields than their predecessors of 50 or 100 years ago. And music is coming back in part because of that higher quality, because people are excited to see an Andrews Nelson's who was discovered, but then took years of training and mentorship to reach a remarkable level that is exciting with a greater range of musical repertory. That's, I think, a bit like life. Art and music, in some ways, are the enjoyment of life, not just the slogging through that most of us have to do a good part of the time. Your points are well taken. I take them as part of something we need to think about. And, really, politics and government should be left, center, and right, not just a particular faction or a particular group that gets elected in this particular cycle.
Well, you know, as always, I find a discussion following presentations to be just energizing. And this is no exception. You folks, I just want to thank you all for taking part, for listening, for commenting. And Vincent, I think this has been a wonderful session. And you've given us a lot to think about, but you put in perspective a lot that we have to think about as citizens. The legislative process is part of our life, and we've got to somehow become more attuned to it. And we have to draw some limits. I think Avi's point is a good one. We need to think through all of these things, and first of all, we have to become informed, and you've helped us along that way. So I want to thank you all for that. And
thank you, Ron, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And don't forget America 250 coming up, the big events, Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, and Patriots Day coming up. I'll be this historian speaker at the official observance on Cambridge Common on Patriots Day observance. Another opportunity to educate and hopefully inspire a bit.
Just a little bit of an advance notice. Our next meeting will not be on Friday, the 26th. It will be on Thursday, the 25th, in order to make adjustments for our speaker to accommodate his schedule. It's going to be on a subject that's of importance to us, given the conversation we had some time back with Jesus Del Alamo about the defined feature sizes on modern microelectronic devices, microchips. This is going to be on atomic scale tomography. It'll be presented by Professor David Seidman, who's at Northwestern University. And just make the comment so that you put it on your calendar for April 25th and not April 26th. All right, folks, have a good weekend. Enjoy Patriots Day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Vincent.
Take care.
Thank you.
You bet. Bye, guys.